So welcome, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Utah Council for Citizen Diplomacy's Ambassador John Price and Marcia Price World Affairs Lecture Series. My name is Emma Russell. I'm the Events and Outreach Director at UCCD. So thank you all so much for attending tonight's lecture, Female Genital Mutilation in America, How Storytelling Can Fuel Social Movements. UCCD always strives to find speakers who exhibit citizen diplomacy. The courage and strength that Maryum and other women's rights activists exhibit is a clear example of this. UCCD is driven by the concept that we all have the right and responsibility to help shape foreign relations. And tonight, as it relates to women's rights activism, we will continue to do this one handshake at a time. I'm extremely excited to see Maryum speak. We're so excited to have her today. But before we welcome her, I have a few announcements and housekeeping items. This is a completely sold out event, so please help us by following these Zoom guidelines. We've chosen to host this lecture in a meeting style rather than a webinar to try to create a sense of community where you guys get to see each other and we get to see you. You are invited to keep your video cameras on. However, please know that this will be a recorded lecture. We also ask that everyone remains muted throughout the lecture to prevent background noise. Lastly, we encourage everyone to use the chat feature of this Zoom meeting to ask any questions or add comments. I will also be attaching links and additional information throughout the lecture in the chat as well. All right, so after Maryum's lecture, we're going to conduct the question and answer session. All questions must be submitted on the chat box. So that's how we will be getting every question, and then Jennifer, our facilitator for this lecture, will then ask the question on your behalf. Although in-person events continue to be suspended, UCCD is committed to providing the same high-quality programming and events virtually. I definitely want to invite all of you guys to learn more about our upcoming UCCD events, and I'm going to just kind of brief you guys on two of the most important ones coming up. So today is just the second of our 4 lectures for the World Affairs Lecture Series this fall. Our next lecture is Pursuing Sustainable and Inclusive Peace in Afghanistan, and this will be presented by Scott Warden, the Director of Afghanistan and Central Asia Programs at the United States Institute for Peace. That lecture will be on Tuesday, October 20th. Additionally, I want to invite you all to join us for a new community podcast, Fireside Chats. This podcast series is inspired by evening radio addresses given by US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, where he would quell rumors and explain his policies. These chats are short conversations with Utah citizen diplomats who are reformulating the American worldview from one of despair to one of hope during a time of multiple crises. UCCD events such as this are only 30 to 40 minutes long so that they're discussion based. It's really a small group and it's made to be an intimate conversation with the audience and the guest speaker. So our next chat is this Thursday with special guest Liz Lamson, a Utah Black Artists Collective founding board member, musician, visual artist, and writer. So she'll be discussing Black and white spaces, discovering the talent of Utah's Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We still have 3 spots available, so I'll be adding the link and you should definitely reserve your spot as soon as possible. All right, so I am incredibly thankful for all of you viewers who are taking your time on this Tuesday evening to join us for this lecture. I definitely acknowledge that Zoom fatigue is real, especially with a lot of us spending our whole day essentially on our laptops. So UCCD is beginning a new engagement activity during our lectures. So at the end of the question and answer session, a Zoom quiz will pop up on everyone's screens. This quiz will be questions based completely on Maryum's lecture, from the moment she begins speaking until the end of the question and answers. We will keep a running tally of all participant scores, and at the end of fall, we're going to give a goodie bag out to the winner. You will also receive bonus points for attending more than one lecture. So definitely sign up for the events that I just mentioned. All right, so again, that quiz will be at the end of the question and answer sessions, so stick around to complete it. All right, so now I will pass it over to UCCD Executive Director, Felicia Maxfield Barrett.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Ambassador John Price and Marcia Price World Affairs Lecture Series. I just want to take a few minutes tonight to thank our generous sponsors. So our namesake of the lecture series, Ambassador John Price and Marcia Price, for their commitment to diplomacy through our World Affairs Lecture Series. Salt Lake City Mayor Aaron Mendenhall and our Arts, Culture, and Events Fund that supports this series. Westminster College and President Dobkin for their continuous support and partnership. World Affair Councils of America for their incredible support and network of partners around the United States, and the residents of Salt Lake County for their continued support of arts, culture, and recreation through the Salt Lake County Zoo Arts and Parks, or ZAP program, in which our lecture series is a recipient. Now, I am pleased to invite Jennifer Hogue, who is a member of the UCCD Board of Directors, but she's also the Executive Director for Engage Now Africa, to introduce tonight's guest speaker, as well as facilitate the question and answer portion of the program. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Jennifer, for facilitating tonight's conversation.
Thank you so much, Felicia, and for Emma. It's a real pleasure to be here. And most importantly, I want to thank Maryum for taking her time and dedicating her life to such an important issue. When I found out from Felicia that she would be speaking because of the work that we do in Africa, this is an issue that we face in our countries that we work in. And so I'm really grateful, Maryum, that you have taken time to spend this evening to educate us about this important issue. Let me take just a second and tell you a little bit about Maryum and who she is. She is actually a women's rights activist who has worked at the intersection of policy and advocacy for over a decade. Most recently, she spent the last year as a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow based at the Human Rights Foundation. Prior to CFR, Maryum was a career Foreign Service officer with the U.S. Department of State, serving as the spokesperson for the U.S. Consulate in Lahore, vice consul at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, and managed the U.S. Embassy Cairo programs on youth engagement and entrepreneurship during the Arab Spring. She's also served as a policy advisor in the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues and the Secretary's Office of Religion and Global Affairs, where she led efforts to integrate women's empowerment and religious actor engagement into a broader U.S. foreign policy strategy. Her personal advocacy work, particularly as a survivor of female genital mutilation, has appeared in The Guardian, Al Jazeera, The Economist, and NPR's Weekend Edition. Maryum also served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Jordan focused on girls' education, and AmeriCorps volunteer in Seattle working with the South Asian and Muslim immigrant survivors of domestic violence. She was a consultant at the Ford Foundation for over a year and a summer institute at the Acumen Fund. Maryum is a graduate of Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and the University of Texas at Austin. She is a Council on Foreign Relations term member and an alumni of the President's Leadership Scholarship Program. And as I mentioned, we're really grateful, Maryum, that you could join us here. We only wish we were doing this all in person so that we could enjoy just your wonderful presence. Before we get started, maybe I could set up this conversation a little bit. And you mentioned this in your bio, that your work has appeared in the Guardian newspaper. And I have had the opportunity to read that article, which I found very inspiring. And so maybe I could direct your attention to sharing with everybody the start of this journey for FGM and how you have become such an eloquent advocate for this issue. And then maybe we could also segue just a little bit into, this is a US conversation about FGM in the United States. But again, I was reading some statistics earlier this afternoon talking about 200 million people throughout the world, at least that we have data for and surveys for, that have suffered this, I guess I could say atrocity, this terrible atrocity in many ways. And maybe have you talk just a little bit about the US perspective, but also about this from a global perspective and what we need to know, and most importantly, what we need to do about this.
Thank you. Thank you so much, for the Center for hosting, Jennifer for introducing. It's such an honor, and it's great to see familiar faces in the Zoom. And I know we live our lives on Zoom now, but it's so great to see former colleagues and other survivors of FGM from my community, and folks that I hope to get to know through this session on this call. So thank you so much for taking the time on an evening after, I'm sure, a full day of being engaged online. So so to kind of start with the first part of your question, Jennifer, about how this all began. And it really, the Guardian, publishing that piece in the Guardian, I think was sort of what gave birth to me as an activist on the issue of FGM. So, I was working at the time in the Secretary's office, a policy advisor in the Secretary's office of religion and global affairs. So it was an office focused on engaging religious actors on a range of issues. So not just on gender, but on climate change, on countering extremism, just a whole variety. And in that particular office, my portfolio happened to be a gender advisor. So so I was working in the Gambia. I was on a field visit at the in Banjul in the Gambia, and there was a Gambian American survivor of FGM who was doing a session engaging religious leaders on this particular issue. So we get to know each other, and I confide in her and I say, actually, I'm a survivor of FGM myself. I've never really publicly vocalized it but I just commended her for her courage in becoming, and at that point she was sort of the only person that was very vocal in the United States on this particular issue. And so she lamented, people assume it's only happening in sub-Saharan Africa, because I'm one of the only people that's speaking out. And I wish that people understood that this is actually a pretty global issue. It's not only focused, as you were mentioning, Jennifer, the data. We know that half the girls in Indonesia are cut before 14. So there's 200 million. It's the more data that we're starting to collect, we're seeing it's actually widespread. It's happening here in the United States across race, religion, geography, socioeconomic class. So so she was sort of nudging me. I think it was in January when I was in Gambia. And so February 6th is International Day of Zero Tolerance against FGM. So she had mentioned the Guardian usually does some sort of awareness raising piece every year. They're very committed to this global campaign, this advocacy campaign. So she said, why don't you write something? And I said, oh no, I'll find some. I love that. I was at the time, State Department, there's a clearance process. So I was like, and I think I was also just not really wanting to do it because I was scared. So I was coming up with 1,000 excuses not to do it. So I said, I'll find somebody in my community who can, publish. So I looked, and there was actually a person who had written a blog piece, beautiful writer, and she graduated from Columbia Journalism School, and she had written this long form piece, and that piece, got a lot of attention. It was well written, and I think it was curated as one of the top long form pieces in long reads. I think it was 15. So so I approached her saying, you don't know me, I've read your piece, I'm a fan, would you be interested in writing for the Guardian? And she said, actually, I'd love to, thank you for the honor, but I'm getting so much backlash. My parents are getting, they're in Pakistan, they're getting a lot of backlash after I wrote this other piece that I thought would go nowhere, but it, got some public attention. So she said, I'm going to keep a low profile so I can't. And so I remember, sort of saying, okay, there weren't that many people. This was 2015, early 2016. There wasn't a lot of, now we're seeing a lot more movement, and a lot of people are vocal, which is amazing, which is kind of the impact of what one story can do to break the silence, to create a snowball effect. So I remember telling my dad, I was like, oh, this person said, no, I don't know what to do. And then he said, well, why don't you tell your story? And I was like, no, again, I was sort of nervous about it. And then I knew writing for me as a form of, kind of therapy. I'd served in Baghdad and other places, war zones, and I used to write a lot just for myself, not really publishing it. So I thought, let me just write this down. I've never really done that before. So I wrote that piece that you read kind of came out of me. It was it was meant to be sort of released in a sense. So I wrote the piece, and I kind of thought about it a bit, and then eventually my dad just kept nudging. He's like, why don't you, I was like, well, it's difficult, it's complicated, I don't want my identity to be fused with this one issue. And so but I just couldn't not do it, in a sense. So I ended up pushing send, and going through pretty, actually relatively easy clearance process, and got the ability to write this in my personal capacity. And it was published. And so then that's kind of where my identity is sort of, and I've grappled with this a lot, who am I? I'm more than just a survivor, but it's been so amazing, I think, hard in a lot of ways because there is backlash, but also pretty phenomenal to see how the story itself, the piece in The Guardian, prompted this conversation, that wasn't really happening publicly in my community. It was happening hush hush, sort of behind closed doors, but it wasn't something that was happening in public discourse. It wasn't something, so that was sort of the beginning of a whole wave of stories that sort of started to come out. And I think, it takes time, for behaviors to change, but I think it had a catalytic impact. And just by chance, around the same time of this piece coming out, there was a case in Australia against members of the community that I'm a part of, the Dawadi Bohra community. It's a subsect of Shi'ism, Shia Islam, mainly concentrated on the western coast of India, but also in Pakistan and the UK, the US, all over. There's a big diaspora. So there was a case that had a lot of attention, and then another one that you brought up here in the United States, which I think is important, in Detroit, in Michigan, where 9 girls were transported from Illinois and Minnesota to Michigan to be cut. So they crossed state lines. So I think the fact that we, had this case, I think it was adjudicated, the final verdict was in 2018, where the federal law was overturned. So I think that was a key moment in the United States in terms of our own issue of grappling with this. We tend to focus a lot my whole career has been focused overseas. So for me, I had to sort of grapple with the fact, oh, wow, we need to look at what's happening right here at home. And so that law was overturned on the grounds of this kind of a technicality, the Commerce Clause, that Congress never had the authority to pass the federal legislation because it was an issue of interstate commerce. And so, that was supposed to, be appealed, and it was, but then the Department of Justice in April of last year, in 2019, dropped the appeal. So what this means in terms of what does this mean for survivors of FGM, advocates that are, pushing against the practice, is that message, the United States has dropped the ban to restore the federal, or stopped the appeal to restore the federal ban. We have no ban, right, at the federal level. It kind of gave a constitutional green light for folks within my community. They were sort of celebrating, like, oh, great, now we can sort of do this without any kind of consequence. So I think it didn't send the right message. The reason it was overturned wasn't because the judge thought that FGM was a good thing. In fact, in his decision, he wrote how abhorrent and how terrible this is. But because of this technicality, it was overturned. So now we're kind of pushing at this stage. What I've been working on is closing the federal loophole, at least at the state level, as well as continuing to push and advocate using storytelling, and there's a whole movement now of survivors within my community, within other communities, that have really been leveraging social media to break the culture of silence on this issue.
Do you want to keep going, or do you want me to ask you?
Feel free to jump in, or we'll keep it as a conversation. Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about, okay, so when the Department of Justice decided not to appeal the ruling,
Yeah.
and the U.S. House of Representatives is now appealing it,
Yep.
Can you give us a sense of the timing of that, and what we could do as citizen diplomats, as advocates, as people who are concerned with this issues? What advice or what counsel would you give to us to point us in the direction if we wanted to do something about this?
So I think at this stage, there are multiple campaigns that are happening at the state level, as well as this continued push to call, for the federal law to be restored. So I think it's activating to first educate yourself on the issue. That's one thing. So, amplifying the stories of survivors. The laws are really important, and I think, but they're not enough. So I'm an advocate of pushing for these bans, even though there are some that say, well, they could drive the practice underground or other things can happen. And my comment to that usually is, we have laws against murder, and murder hasn't been abolished, right? So, so yes, the law isn't necessarily going to solve the problem entirely, but it sets a normative framework. And so I think, being vocal with your local representatives, if you're in a state, I know Utah has recently banned FGM, I think last year. I launched a campaign, or my brother actually on my behalf launched a campaign in Washington State, which doesn't have a ban. So kind of, there's now 35 states that have banned FGM, 15 that don't have state level ban. So I think it's important. When I started doing the work, I'm not, again, I'm on a sabbatical from the State Department. This isn't my sort of full-time thing, but I'm learning about state and local politics now, which I didn't know much about, to be honest, before. I'm learning a lot about, sort of the terrain here. And I think, with the pushing for the state level legislation comes the awareness building, comes sort of, engaging with communities that may have no exposure to this. I mean, when I've shared my story in The Guardian back in, early 2016, colleagues were shocked. They were like, what, you don't look like an FGM survivor. We thought it was in sub-Saharan Africa, it's sort of over there. When I did the NPR piece on Weekend Edition, which my mom is obsessed with NPR, so she's so excited. And, but, the friend who we met in Cairo, who's a journalist, and she said, one thing that it struck me is that when you speak, on radio, you don't look like, people are assuming somebody with an accent, an immigrant coming, so they're not expecting someone to, like, I don't sound like the FGM survivor, so I think that's one thing that's important, is being very sort of aware that this is something that's happening in communities you may not expect. I even learned through the process, after the case was brought to trial in Detroit, there was a survivor in Kentucky. Her name is Jenny. So she's been sort of pushing, she's a white American Christian survivor of FGM. And when I heard her story, I was shocked. I didn't think it was happening, here, I assumed it was happening in, my community in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. There are indigenous communities in Latin America, but I didn't really know. And that was fascinating for me to know that it was happening here, and then to learn the history, in her story, for example, she's from a Christian community. Her sister was cut, her father was a priest. And so her whole congregation, subscribes to this. Much like in my community, the head of the community, the religious leader, has nothing to do with Islam at all, but his interpretation, a patriarchal interpretation of the religion, which happens in all of religions, has prescribed this as some sort of mandatory prerequisite in order, to be part of this community, to get married. It's sort of this requirement. And the same, I was shocked, was applied in her sort of very, kind of also very obscure subsect of Christianity that, just they have their own kind of rules and norms. And so that was fascinating. So when she told her story, it mirrored mine. She was 7 years old when she was cut. I was 7 years old when I was cut. In my case, I was in India. My parents were in the United States. My aunt cut me without their consent. In her case, and my aunt actually, I remember she bribed me with like a chocolate bar as like sort of to lure me down to her clinic. And in Jenny's case, her mother, they went on a special girls trip to get this done. And later she was kind of bribed with a big cake. And I thought, wow, my gosh, like we're from such different worlds. I'm from, an recent immigrant from India originally, family, totally different background. She's from Kentucky. She's white, Christian, but yet our stories have kind of converged. And so for me, that was really powerful to know that this is pretty, it's broader than we think. We have to kind of question our assumptions. And even the history here, I mean, it was a cure. I didn't know this until I started researching, because I'm not an expert until I sort of stumbled into this work. And it was a cure for hysteria. FGM, female genital mutilation, was a cure for hysteria in the United States and Europe up until the 19th century. So physicians were performing this. And my mother, who is also a survivor, she's a physician, and she was horrified. She was like, wow, like doctors used to do that. That's crazy, so she was like, it's crazy to me. This was considered a, cure for hysteria. So I think I've been uncovering and learning so much throughout this whole process. And I think for others as well, I think, the panels like these to educate on the issue. And then once you're sort of informed, I think taking action, whether it's calling representatives, whether it's, donating to organizations that are working on the ground. I'm the U.S. Advisory Board Chair of an organization called Saifee, which kind of focuses on storytelling and kind of getting the conversations going at the very grassroots level within the community.
Great. Two points that I wanted to make, Maryum, and that was I was reading some statistics coming out of the CDC, and forgive me, they were a little old. I couldn't find anything newer, but in 2013, they estimated that over 500,000 women under the age of 18, a third of those being under the age of 18 in the United States, had actually experienced some form of FGM. And I found that to be, obviously in the United States, of all places, a little bit disturbing. In the last 10 minutes, we have about 10 minutes before we start opening up for questions. I was reading today, and if people are really interested in this issue, I was gratified to come across a document called Female Genital Mutilation Cutting, a Call for Global Response, that was published in March of 2020.
Okay.
And the publication went through and just basically summarized all of the countries and gave the latest data of the countries that are in many ways some of the worst dare we say abusers of them. But let me just read to you a portion of what they said and ask for your response. According to UNICEF figures, FGM affects at least 2 million women and girls in 31 countries. This figure only includes countries where there is available data, and it is widely acknowledged that this piece presents an incomplete picture of the global phenomena. Much of FGM prevalence data currently available is based on verbal surveys and self-reporting. Clinical examinations are uncommon. The assumption is that women respond truthfully when asked about their FGM status and that they know the type and extent that was performed. Many FGM procedures are performed at a very young age. Many cultures feel taboo about such discussions, and a number of such factors raise the possibility that the validity of survey responses might be incorrect or potentially underreported. And let me go back and say, they're saying 200 million people, women, girls, in 31 countries. So when you read those kind of statistics, you read the 500,000 here, the 200 million globally, and that's predominantly, as you said, in kind of the Horn of Africa and Asia and some of these other parts of the world. I'm a policy person by trade. So how would you, again, going back to the laws and advocating for laws, but as people who maybe work in NGOs or work in global countries or work with people who might experience this, what would be your advice to us? How do we make changes? Again, I work in Sierra Leone, where according to the data, it's 90% of the women. And what can I do? What can we do to be a part of the solution to this problem?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I would say, when I was in the Office of Global Women's Issues and we were grappling with this, we had a Senator Reid at the time before he retired, issued this Government Accountability Office report that was pretty scathing that the state, we hadn't done much. And so my boss at the time, the ambassador, was like, what can we do? What's your policy prescription? And I think the first thing is understand the issue. I think that was, we need to invest in the data collection. Like you were saying, like we need to understand what interventions are working, what interventions aren't. It has to be evidence-based. So number one is actually, it's not the sexiest or the funnest thing, like data, but it's so critical. And so I think even in my community, we're doing surveys. I just filled one out actually this morning on, attitudes, who the demographics, are how are minds changing, and what's working, right? Like how are people getting their information? How are they, is it social media? Is it elsewhere? What are the drivers? So data is huge, and research and evidence-based kind of formations of policy. The second is really focusing on the survivor-led movements that are on the ground. They'll be the ones sort of, for example, even when I was working in West Africa, where you are, we hosted this conference in Senegal, bringing together, groups from Sierra Leone, from Guinea, from the Gambia, from Mali, all over. It's Francophone, different languages. And we learned, in Sierra Leone, it's not religion that's the driver. It's a coming of age ceremony, this bondo, this ritual. And it's more of a rural issue. I'm generalizing because it's not totally, but largely it's an urban to rural issue. In Gambia, it was tribal. So there were Muslims that practiced and Muslims that didn't. And it was really based on tribe. So in every place, understanding sort of the survivors on the ground, the groups on the ground, local organizations. One of the challenges, I would say, from a policy perspective with that is that we tend to give to these big organizations, so it's easier to fund one big organization than 100 or maybe a dozen small ones. So finding mechanisms to make sure that you're giving to the groups on the ground, and not just small. There's an organization that's amazing called Girl Generation that gives project-specific grants, small micro grants. There's a sort of missing middle layer, I would say, that's, groups that are growing that, need some of the overhead, need some of the, maybe 100,000, 200,000. So that's what we did actually, was to sort of give that middle layer amount, not so much that it's too big to absorb for a small or medium-sized organization, but start investing in those groups that are on the ground, because they're the ones that are going to come up with the solutions that will make the most sense. So that's what I would say is the data, the resources to the groups on the ground. And then the third thing is to really reframe this whole narrative, that it's often FGM is seen as, oh, it's over there, it's exotic, this cultural thing. And really it's a human rights issue. It's like any other form of gender-based violence. It's about power, it's about controlling female sexuality. And I think we have to ground it in that sort of rights-based kind of narrative, and also really think about it instead of, people always ask, how, there's 4 types of cutting, what did you go through? What type of cutting? I think we need to close the space for adjudicating cutting, like the types, and instead talk about like, what is the world we want? We want girls to live free of violence. They should be free to just be whole. That's it, just free to be whole. And that means, so whether it's a nick, a prick, a cut, this much, that much, it doesn't even matter at this point. There's a huge emotional toll. There's the physical trauma, there's the psychological trauma. We have to focus on sort of, keeping girls just whole, intact completely, emotionally and psychologically and physically at the same time. The World Health Organization has stated, and I think it was like their second most tweeted tweet. I think I remember we were at a conference and they said, we tweeted that FGM serves no medical purpose and only causes harm. So anyone who tries to sort of say there's some medical reason, it's nonsense. It's not. So there's no reason to do it.
We have several questions.
Oh, sure.
that I'll ask you. Some of them are private. Some of them were sent to me privately. I'm sorry, I don't know the names of them, so I'll just read you the questions and then let you respond as you see fit. Both stories Maryum shared were matriarchs who encouraged FGM, which is eye-opening. And while speaking with elected officials might be a step in the right direction, what can be done regarding the role that matriarchs play in this practice?
No, it's a great question because it is an intergenerational form of structural
Let
violence.
me interrupt and just and then let me tack on the second question,
Sure,
and you can wrap these two in. And what's your opinion on male circumcision?
Okay, great. Both are great questions. So in terms of the sort of women perpetrating violence against women, right, generation after generation, it's an interesting piece to this question. The overarching, at least in the context of my community, is the religious leader, his honorific, his name is the Sayyidna, which basically means like our leader, is a male. And he's the one that's sort of dictating this decree that this is mandated. So it's still grounded in patriarchy, even though women are the ones perpetrating this. So it's a complex issue. And I think it requires a lot of, kind of on the ground conversations. I noticed, like, for example, when I published that piece, there was this really interesting, actually, there was somebody, because, Facebook has like this like messaging sent box of people you don't know. So I usually never check it because you never know who's gonna, these random people. So there was somebody who messaged me who I didn't know. This was maybe a week or two after I published. And then I was having this anxiety of like, oh my God, I'm overexposed. Like, what have I done? Like, this is too much. I don't know. And so this person messages me and she's like, you don't know me. I'm from Texas. I am also from the same community. I also was cut. I also kind of the same because I blacked out from this whole experience and didn't remember my FGM experience until I was 17 when I was sitting in an anthropology course at University of Texas. So just, she had kind of a similar jarring memory jolt experience. So we had all this in common. She's Texan. She had this, she's from the community. And she said, kudos to you for sharing. Unfortunately, my community, my parents are really part of this community. My parents aren't, so I've had a lot more freedom, but I just will never be able to share my story. And I was like, felt kind of like, okay, at least I've comforted someone, or, that someone feels less alone. Fast forward, maybe not even a month later, 2 months later, I see this New York Times piece on FGM in my community, and it's about the Detroit case specifically and what's happening. There was a lot of coverage at that point. And so I look at the cover, there's a woman, I don't know who she is. And then she had added me on Facebook. So all of a sudden I see her name pop up, and she was on the cover of the New York Times health section, right? I was shocked because I wouldn't even put my face to this at this point. Like, she was even more courageous than I was. And so that really showed to me like the power of this, and so in terms of, women perpetrating against women, but also they're the ones that can just in one generation end it, just can be part of history. If somebody decides, I'm not going to do this to my daughter or my niece or, a member of my family, I'm going to speak out. Now that the issue is out in the open, no one can say they didn't know. Like in my case, my, father had no clue like what this was. My mom, my dad's sister did it to me, so my mom had no idea. So there was sort of this like they weren't even given the opportunity to just give consent or non-consent. And in a lot of cases, men are not really aware of what's going on. But now I don't think it'd be hard to argue that, given it's just sort of out there. It's on social media and it's published. So, and to talk about sort of male circumcision, I think that's a great question. So the World Health Organization has weighed in on FGM and stated clearly, no medical purpose, only causes harm. They haven't made the same they haven't issued the same guidance on male circumcision. And I don't have any particular sort of, I'm pro or against male circumcision, but what I would say is that they're just two different procedures. Purely, the equivalent of FGM for men is castration. So circumcision is a completely different. So even when we talk about FGM, I think it's so important to use the right kind of language for it. And I don't know if there's perfect language for it, but I rarely ever use the term female circumcision, largely because it conflates it with male circumcision and it creates a false dichotomy. They're not the same thing. So I often get that question, and it's not to say that I think male circumcision is good or bad. I'm just, if we focus on FGM specifically, it's actually cutting the organ itself. It's a form of castration. And again, echoing the World Health Organization, which I do all the time, is that there's no reason to do it. There's no evidence for a justification for why.
Okay, I've got two more questions for you. Thank you so much for your time and vulnerability. As an incoming FSO, also PD, I would love to know what you've learned or tools you would recommend to give others the tools to tell their powerful and personal stories, both at home and abroad, in a way that upholds their dignity, which I really actually appreciate this question, because as I work with people in Sierra Leone, are there some things that I could do if people wanted to tell their story? How could I, not that I want to mobilize them and say overthrow the government, but if they wanted to do it in a way that would be empowering to them. So I love her question as well.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. I don't know if I have like the best answer for it, because I think I myself am sort of navigating this. I would say this is one piece that I've been kind of grappling with a bit is, the storyteller, the survivor who's telling the story, and then the story itself. And so there's kind of this, for me, it felt cathartic when I told my story. I was like, oh, it's out there. It's sort of, I've been unburdened. But then, it also gets attached to you in a way, like you can't sort of shake it off. So I always sort of am like, who am I? Am I, a foreign service officer? Am I, from Texas? Am I an FGM survivor? And the FGM survivor shadow sort of follows me wherever I go. And one thing my father said, which I thought was really, I remember because I had this moment where I was like, you gave me this advice to like write in the Guardian, and now this is just consuming like my identity, and maybe you gave me bad advice, and I was feeling kind of ashamed, or I don't know, just sort of self-conscious. And he was like, why are you embarrassed? Like, you didn't do anything wrong. Like, why are you ashamed? And I think that was like really powerful and profound coming from him. I don't think he realized it at the time, like what it meant to have him say that to me. But I think that, when people are sort of contemplating whether or not to tell their stories, I think, you can't really, I would never push anyone to do it. I think, even when I was trying to nudge this other person to tell their story so I didn't have to tell mine, I'm glad that, she said, hey, no, I have a boundary. This is, I'm dealing with this backlash, and it's a lot. It's not easy. So really respecting the boundaries of survivors and meeting them where they're at. Some are going to be in a position where they feel like, yes, guns blazing, I want to do this. And others are going to not be in a position to. And now that I understand what it's like to get some of that backlash, even when I have a really proud, amazing dad and mom, and, people who, my inner nuclear family is very supportive. I have an extended family that's been not so, they've been uncomfortable with this. And so that's been hard for me to kind of navigate that. So I would say being a support network after the story is told, because you don't know what the impact is going to be. And I think encouraging it, and then those who are, I would say to donors, like, in the policy space, but also the philanthropy space, is to really invest in mental health. It's something, I come from a culture where mental health is just not prioritized at all. They're like, why would you see a therapist? They don't understand. Like, even my own dad was like, why would you? And I just recently started to, and it's just such a gift, having a clinician, someone who's trained with an eye to kind of ask those questions to help you sort of understand the tripwires, the triggers, setting the boundaries. So I think, in the process of encouraging the storytelling is just making sure there are some guardrails. It's still going to be hard regardless, even if you have someone that's trauma informed, that's involved in the process, but keeping that in mind whenever possible, that those spaces that are there for the storytelling are safe.
Okay, we have another very great observation from Gina. We understand that anyone who speaks out about an injustice based on race, gender, sexuality, religion, whatever, worries about it being reduced to victimhood. It's yet another way to keep us silent. We must inhibit all of our space, as Maryum does, activist, diplomat, artist, storyteller, mentor, friend, so many parts that make an amazing woman. We need not be afraid. And I like her comment because it's going back to this notion that you talked about as a whole woman.
Yeah.
You're not FGM, but you are a mentor, a friend, a storyteller, an artist, a diplomat, an activist. And I think that's a really beautiful way to maybe, again, when you think about the triggers or the tripwires, is, well, that's just one thing, but there is beauty behind all of the work and all of the roles that you fulfill in society and all the roles that you fill as a family. And so, what would you, maybe just thinking about what Gina said, what would you say to somebody who might be struggling with that very one definition of a person, to teach them to think more expansively and holistically about who they are?
I love this question. And I actually love the person who asked it. Ambassador Gina Abercrombie with Stanley is amazing. It's such a mentor for me. I would say, that I'm learning actually to sort of embrace the fact that, I might be seen in this one box, but I actually push a bit to say, hey, when I'm speaking on panels, I'm more than a survivor. Survivors are more than just their story. There's so much more. There's a multiplicity of identities. Like you were saying, like so many things. I'm an aunt to a very quirky 10-year-old niece. It's just, I have all these kind of identities, and so being able to kind of embrace them all and and not sort of let this one piece take over, I'd say. It takes a lot of, for me, I've been, with this therapist in particular, it's been good to sort of be able to rewire these narratives that are in my head, because I've been so focused on, how others are perceiving, or, even like, I don't know, this is getting maybe too personal, but even just like online dating, you're so exposed, and people Google you, and then the first thing that comes up is this. And I was like, oh no, this must be. And then I've had to kind of train myself. I was like, I don't know what people are actually thinking of when they see, my name or this issue, and so being able to kind of, just, and if somebody were to judge me on that in a negative way, then that's not, I don't know, it says more about them potentially than it does about me. So I think it's been, it's a process. It's not an easy thing, but I feel lucky to have kind of these support networks and mentors and family members and champions and others that have kind of helped to echo as I rewire those positive narratives in my head, to kind of keep amplifying them. So I would say to other survivors and others, not just survivors of FGM, but anyone who's gone through trauma. I mean, we're at a traumatic moment in our history, this reckoning, long overdue reckoning on race, 400 years overdue. And so there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of trauma. We're in a pandemic, fragility, right? Our lives are kind of upended by this, because we don't know at any moment. And so I think being kind to ourselves and being just compassionate with ourselves, I think, and embracing all of our identities, and celebrating that with others.
We have about 10 minutes left. Let me open it up just to anybody who might want to ask a question to Maryum before we close. If not, I have one or two additional questions that I would like to ask. But before I do that, wanted to just find out if anybody else had any burning questions that they would like to hear Maryum respond to.
I have a question. Can I just ask it, or do you want me to type it?
No, please go ahead, Kimberly.
You can ask.
I'm loving everything that I'm hearing, and something that's coming up for me is that I don't want to try to be like a white savior, like, oh, here's this problem. And I know that was talked about, like, it's in all sorts of communities, but I really don't want to try to step into a space that is taking up, like, is making it then more about me.
Right.
And so I know that you mentioned like amplifying voices, different voices, and I'm just curious, like, how can I, if you have any directions of where to find those voices, or
absolutely,
what to do with that. Thank you.
That's a great question, and something I wanted to talk about, so I'm glad you asked. There's some amazing organizations just within the last few years that have sort of blossomed. One is the US Network to End FGM. So if you Google that, it's actually kind of a clearinghouse of all these grassroots organizations. So there's one that I'm a part of. So I'm on the steering committee of this US Network to End FGM. And then there's a group called
Maryum, what's it called? And I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah.
For
we can just type it in the chat. Exactly. It's called the United States Network to End FGM. That's the network. Exactly. So so that's a great starting point. There's a ton of resources, they have webinars, and they have a list of organizations as well, that are grassroots organizations, survivor led. There's the organization I'm part of called Saifee. It's mainly focused on my community, but it's broader. It has stories from others, from West Africa, from Horn of Africa, from Indonesia, from Jenny's stories there as well, from Kentucky. So we've sort of everywhere. And that's been great because it's these short, 90-second videos that you can share those stories on your social media platform. And it's a great way to sort of help educate others, because many people just have no idea. I think that's the main issue. When I confront it, they're like, really, America? Like, no, it's supposed to be in Africa. So I think it's helping by just sharing their own stories on your platform. It's amazing to sort of, and it's part of the reason I was so excited to come to this venue in Utah, or virtually now, but hopefully one day in person, is because many people just don't know. And so I do as much as I can in terms of outreach to as many places. I don't assume people know about it. So as in your position as someone who's not in a community that practices FGM, it's so great if you can kind of raise awareness. And you may not know, there could be people in your circle that are survivors that just aren't vocal about it. So you've created a safe space for them by sharing a story and kind of creating a conversation potentially.
And let me also add something about the importance of storytelling. I know in some of the countries in Africa where we work, it is not talked about. It is secret.
Yeah.
And nobody talks about it. And so if you can't talk about it, first of all, you don't know what's happened. You don't know what's happened to you. You don't know, you just know something has happened to you. But to be able to encourage people in an appropriate way, with appropriate boundaries, with the appropriate words, to be able to tell that story, I think that there's freedom and a sense of empowerment that comes along also perhaps with the feelings of feeling a little bit more like a victim.
Yeah.
But I love that idea because I can't get anybody to talk about it in some of these countries. And it's extremely discouraging because if you can't talk about it, then you can't solve it.
Yeah,
We have
exactly.
another question. One more question, and then this will be actually our last one. And then I will actually turn the time over to Felicia to close us.
Great.
Let me just ask this last question. When we talk about gender-based violence in the United States, it seems like that female genital mutilation is frequently left out of the discussion. Why?
Great question. I think it goes back to what your comment. It's not talked about. It's not seen as an American issue. So I wrote a piece earlier this year in Miss Magazine, and it was about when can FGM have its Me Too moment, right? It's not integrated into gender-based violence conversations. It's not integrated. It should be. It's a form of sexual assault. It's a child protection issue. It's a form of child sexual abuse. So we really should be integrating it. But I think because it's framed as this exotic over there issue, it's not seen as a human rights issue, a form of gender-based violence. It absolutely is all of those things. But it's so, it's siloed. It's happening kind of in a faraway place. It's a cultural thing. And so what I've been doing, and I think so many others have, survivors that are speaking out saying, hey, listen, we need to actually pull this into the conversation around gender-based violence, just like we talk about domestic violence and sexual harassment and and child marriage. Like this is part of the structural violence. It's part of the equation. So so that's been one of the it's a great question that you asked, and I think it's happening more, that it's becoming, I know, for example, the State Department had an entire adolescent girls strategy and a gender-based violence strategy where FGM was front and center inside that. And so in the policy documents, you see it, but in terms of the kind of grassroots kind of advocacy work, it's not as visible that you see. And so that's one thing that I've been working on, actually. And I think the more, even for example, if you share something, here's a tactical takeaway, is that if you're sharing a story about FGM, there's so many now that are out there, videos and whatnot, that add the hashtag Me Too, or add the hashtag GBV, or October 11th is International Day of the Girl. Add the hashtag Day of the Girl, and then you can sort of, in a social media sense, like bring it into the broader conversation. Because the more it's siloed, I mean, I'll put in hashtag end FGM, for example, when I'll publish, just to keep it there. But I also add other ones. Generation equality. This is 25 years since the Beijing Declaration. Why are 200 million women and girls suffering the consequences of FGM? We have a long way to go. So I think using some of these galvanizing moments that are centered on gender-based violence and gender equality broadly is a great way to also just bring FGM into that conversation. So thank you. That was a really great question.
Okay, I want to ask one more question in the 3 minutes that I have, and then I'm going to actually turn the time over to Emma and not Felicia. But there's one more question. How often does the religious argument come up when you're trying to fight against FGM, and how do you argue against it? So you have about 2.5 minutes to answer this question.
Okay. So I would say simple answer to that. It's not in the Quran. It's not in the Bible. FGM has nothing to do with religion at all. The issue that we sometimes will face, and why religion is part of the conversation is that there are religious leaders, Christian, Muslim, from different communities that do interpret the text. It's not so it's not in the Bible or the Quran, and there are but sayings of the prophet, let's say, or these sort of like traditions that are resurrected, and those patriarchal interpretations are what is then preached, but it's actually not part of doctrine at all. And most, I mean, you have like the Sheikh of Al-Azhar in Egypt, you have Coptic bishops and others that have all come down and said, you know, I think even the Pope, the Vatican, they've all said that it has nothing to do with religion. So every mainstream sort of religious leader across faith traditions has said that this has nothing to do with religion at all. So that's, it's not part of it, but yeah. So it's
Well, I guess I like the fact that you're talking about reframing the story to contain accurate facts. This isn't a religious issue. This is a human rights issue. This is a gender-based violence issue, and taking it out of those realms, those more, you know, oh, this is a religion, you know, God said to do this. You know, how do you argue against something like that? But really reframing that issue based upon accurate facts.
Exactly.
Instead of cultural norms.
Right. And just misperceptions. Exactly.
Right. Okay. Wonderful. Maryum, thank you so very much.
Thanks to everyone who was here. My goodness, it's just amazing.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it, and such great questions.
And then I'll turn the time, Emma, back over to you.
Sounds great. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Maryum. I learned so much in this conversation. So it was incredible to hear you talk. And I'm so grateful and honored that we were able to have you even virtually. So just thank you all for joining us this evening. In just a moment, I will be sharing our Zoom quiz on the lecture you just listened to as I state my closing remarks. So if you want to enter our competition, definitely participate in our poll. All right, so you should all receive that. And so I'll leave it up and active as I continue. So I just want to thank Maryum for this incredible lecture. I also want to thank Jennifer for being our facilitator, and as always, Ambassador John Price, Marcia Price, for providing the continued support for this lecture series. I also want to thank all of the participants who took time from their Tuesday afternoon to join us today. I hope that you guys all enjoyed this lecture and learned something as well. I highly encourage everyone to sign up for our future lectures, as well as Fireside Chats. Lastly, after this lecture, I will be sending an email to anyone who is registered, and it'll have a survey about your experience, how this virtual platform worked for you, your interest level, as well as a link to the recording of this lecture so that you can share it with anyone that missed it but was wanting to come. All right, so this lecture is over. Thank you all again. I will stay on and keep the quiz live for anyone who's answering it. So thanks again. You are free to exit. Have a wonderful week.
Thank you guys so much. Really, I appreciate this. Thank you. Thank you.
Of course.
Bye.
It was so nice to have you. Bye.
Thank you.